Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Carlos Alberto, the thinker. The conflict in the Middle East is probably one of the most difficult scenarios to interpret in today's world. Decades of confrontations, religious tensions, territorial disputes, strategic interests, and deeply rooted narratives have created a reality that, at first glance, seems impossible to solve. For a long time, the analysis of the Middle East has been dominated by narratives. Every actor presents their own version. Every society adopts its own interpretation. And in that process, reality becomes fragmented. Depth is lost. Perspective is lost. And the possibility of building something better is lost. The Middle East is not a single conflict. It is the overlapping of multiple factors, borders drawn without historical coherence, deeply rooted cultural and religious identities, and constant global interests intervening in the region. But there is one factor that runs through much of this conflict, and it needs to be understood with greater precision: the struggle for power. In geopolitics, power is neither infinite nor indefinite. It manifests in specific ways: the ability to influence decisions, the ability to sustain a position over time, and the ability to project a vision of the world. And here appears a key element: ideological power. Because it's not just about territory or resources, it's also about imposing, sustaining, or defending a particular way of seeing reality, an interpretation of order, a sense of legitimacy, a conception of how collective life should be organized. And when these visions collide, the dispute stops being purely material. It becomes structural. Each side is not only defending its interests, it is defending its way of understanding the world. And that makes the conflict much harder to resolve, because it's not enough to negotiate resources or territories. You also have to manage perceptions, identities, and principles. From Stoic Geopolitics, we don't observe this to take sides. We observe it to understand. Because once we recognize that there is a struggle for power, material, strategic, and ideological, the analysis becomes complete. The puzzle begins to fall into place. And when it does, it allows something fundamental: to stop merely reacting and to start truly interpreting. And when our interpretation improves, a new possibility opens up: the possibility of working toward balance. Balances that are never permanent, because the pendulum of history keeps swinging, but balances that can be managed: spaces of relative stability, moments of reduced tension, instances where conflict doesn't disappear, but is contained. And here we see an important sign of our time, because even within this struggle for power, attempts at understanding are beginning to emerge. Attempts at negotiation, attempts to avoid scenarios of total confrontation. They are not always visible, they are not always successful, but they exist. And that makes a difference. It shows that, beyond the dispute, there is an awareness of its limits. Total war means the triumph of one side, but also the subjugation of the other. And in an interconnected world, that outcome rarely produces lasting stability. That's why, even amid tension, paths are being sought. Not definitive ones, but possible ones. And in that search, Stoic geopolitics finds solid ground. Not to solve the conflict immediately, but to better understand its dynamics and to direct our energy toward where it can actually produce results. Because the struggle for power has historically been one of the most constant forces in the evolution of peoples. But the way that struggle is managed is what ultimately defines its outcome. We must also point out that in this region, that power is deeply tied to a strategic resource: oil. For decades, the control, production, and distribution of oil have made the Middle East a key point in the global balance. Not only for its economic value, but for its impact on the functioning of the modern world. Energy, industry, transportation, much of the global system depends directly or indirectly on this resource. And when a resource is that important, it becomes an axis of power. But power does not act alone. It combines with perceptions, fears, and historical memories. And that's where collective psychology comes into play. Entire generations have grown up within a logic of conflict, inherited narratives, accumulated experiences, and visions of the other that often solidify into unquestionable truths. This is where Stoic geopolitics introduces an essential difference, because it doesn't begin with the conflict, it begins with how we observe it. And that way of observing rests on four key pillars. The first is the dichotomy of control. Not everything can be controlled, but we can always control how we respond. This distinction prevents useless wear and tear and allows us to focus our energy on what can actually be transformed. The second pillar is virtue as the essential good. Coherence, justice, temperance, and clarity allow us to sustain decisions in complex contexts. Without principles, there is no direction. The third pillar is cosmopolitanism. All peoples share the same human condition. Recognizing this opens spaces of respect. Without respect, there is no dialogue, and without dialogue, no lasting balance is possible. The fourth pillar is the pendulum of history. History is not linear, it oscillates between order and chaos, between stability and uncertainty. Every phase contains tensions, but also opportunities. Understanding the pendulum helps us better interpret the moment, knowing when to advance, when to wait, and when to consolidate. Because the peoples who understand this movement don't try to solve everything in one blow. They understand that history is built step by step, through small but consistent decisions, through gradual but sustained progress, through cumulative achievements that over time create profound transformations. And in that process, something fundamental appears: strategy. Not a strategy based on urgency, but one based on understanding the historical moment. However, to fully understand this conflict, we must also look at the attempts at solutions. Lately, the main parties involved have participated in multiple instances of dialogue, negotiation, and rapprochement. In the pursuit of partial agreements, proposals for coexistence, and international mediations, all these efforts reflect a reality that is often overshadowed by the visible conflict. There is a search. These attempts can be seen as small steps upward, steps that, although not always visible in the short term, are part of a broader evolution. A small light in the middle of the darkness. And this is where Stoic geopolitics finds one of its most important points. It doesn't focus solely on the conflict, but on the opportunities that exist within it. Because even in the most difficult scenarios, there are always points of convergence, shared interests, common needs, and possible spaces for understanding. And it is on those points that real progress can be built. Everything we are experiencing is part of a larger process, a process of evolution. We don't know its beginning, nor its end, but we do know one thing: humanity moves forward, advancing between conflicts and agreements, between tensions and balances. And in that movement, the Middle East conflict represents a hot point within the pendulum of history, but also an opportunity, the opportunity to understand better, to correct mistakes, and to build new forms of relationship. That's why, rather than focusing our energy on confrontation, we should focus it on the points of agreement. Because even in the most complex scenarios, there are always common grounds, and it is on those grounds that agreements can be built, small but real, that can become the first steps towards something greater. Stoic geopolitics was not created to impose ideologies. It doesn't seek to tell us what to think, but to help us think better. It was born as a tool for analysis, a tool for understanding, a way to observe the world with greater clarity. In times when narratives often confuse more than they explain, Stoic geopolitics brings us closer to a deeper understanding, a small light on the path, because in the end, it's not just about understanding the world, it's about building something better within it. Dear friends, the time has come to say goodbye. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to subscribe. It helps us a lot to reach more people. Turn on the notification bell, leave a comment. Your opinions are important and so are your suggestions. It's all free. See you in the next video. A big hug to everyone. And remember, thinking well is living better.